The phone call came on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was standing in my apartment, still in my pajamas despite it being nearly noon, scrolling through job listings that all seemed to require qualifications I didn't have. 3 weeks after being laid off from the marketing firm where I'd worked for 5 years, I was starting to feel the walls of my Portland apartment closing in. That's when my phone lit up with my best friend Taylor's name. "Alex, are you sitting down?" Her voice was tense, carefully controlled in that way people sound when they're trying not to reveal too much emotion. "I'm standing, but I can sit. What's going on?" I lowered myself onto my couch, something cold spreading through my chest. "I just drove past Lake Chelan on my way back from visiting my parents." She hesitated. "There's a sold sign in front of your family's vacation home." The vacation home. My grandfather's cedar cabin that sat on 3 acres of lakefront property. The place where I'd spent every summer of my childhood. The place my parents had promised would always stay in our family. "That's impossible," I said, my voice hollow. My parents would have told me if they were selling it. But even as I said the words, I knew it was possible. More than possible. It made perfect sense. My parents, Robert and Linda Mitchell, had been talking about early retirement for months. They'd been dropping hints about downsizing, about simplifying, but they'd never once mentioned selling the lake house, the one place that held all my best memories, the one place I felt truly connected to my grandfather. "I'm so sorry, Alex. I took a picture if you want me to send it." "No," I said quickly. "No, I believe you. I need to call my parents." After hanging up, I sat there, phone in hand, trying to process what I'd just learned. The lake house had been my sanctuary, my escape. It was where I'd learned to swim, where I'd had my first kiss on the dock under the stars, where I'd scattered some of my grandfather's ashes in the flower garden he'd loved. And now it was gone, sold, without so much as a conversation. My fingers hovered over my parents' contact information, but something stopped me from making the call. A memory surfaced, my father's voice, cold and dismissive, telling me 3 weeks ago that losing my job was a consequence of poor planning, and that maybe now I'd consider a real position at the family business. The condescension in his tone when he'd said I needed to grow up and face reality. Instead of calling, I opened my browser and searched for Lake Chelan real estate transactions. It took less than 10 minutes to confirm what Taylor had told me. The Mitchell family cabin had sold 3 days ago for $1.2 million. My parents had made a small fortune on a property they'd inherited, a property that had been promised to me since I was a child. The shock gave way to something darker, something that burned in my chest and behind my eyes. This wasn't just about money. This was about trust, about promises broken without a second thought, about being erased from decisions that shaped my past and my future. I finally called my mother, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "Oh, Alexandra," she said, sounding distracted. "Your father and I were going to tell you this weekend when you came for dinner. We've had such a wonderful opportunity come up with our retirement planning. Jordan at the investment firm has found us this marvelous opportunity that will let us retire 3 years earlier than we planned." She continued talking, never once acknowledging what they'd done or what the lake house meant to me. It was just an asset to be liquidated, a means to an end. When I finally managed to ask directly about the sale, my mother's voice took on that practiced lightness she used when smoothing over uncomfortable truths. "Darling, you know your father and I aren't getting any younger. The upkeep on that old place was becoming such a burden. And honestly, when was the last time you even visited? It was just sitting there, a financial drain. We're being practical. Practical. As if my memories, my inheritance, my attachment to the last piece of my grandfather I had left were just impractical sentimentality." "I understand," I said, though I didn't. Not really. "I have to go. I have a job interview." It was a lie. but I needed to end the conversation before I said something I couldn't take back. As I hung up, something shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, but now it was hardening into something else. A cold, clear resolve. If my parents could make unilateral decisions about my inheritance, perhaps it was time I took a more active interest in their financial affairs. After all, family assets should be a family concern, shouldn't they? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The grief hit in waves over the next few days. I'd be fine one moment, sending out job applications or making myself dinner, and the next I'd be overwhelmed by memories of summer nights on the lake house porch, watching fireflies with my grandfather while he told stories about my father as a boy. The property wasn't just a vacation spot, it was the repository of 4 generations of Mitchell family history. My history. I called my brother Michael, expecting him to share my outrage, but his response left me cold. "What did you expect, Alex? You've been avoiding family responsibilities for years. Mom and Dad don't owe you a consultation on every financial decision they make." "It wasn't just a financial decision," I argued. "That house was supposed to stay in the family. Grandpa's been gone for 8 years, Michael cut in. "And let's be honest, if you'd taken Dad up on his offer to work for the company, they probably would have kept you in the loop. But you had to go do your own thing in Portland." And there it was, the real issue. My decision to pursue marketing instead of joining Mitchell Commercial Development had always been treated as a betrayal. Despite my success before the layoff, my parents had never fully supported my independence. In their eyes, choosing my own path was rejecting the family legacy. After that conversation, I spent the night staring at my ceiling, mind racing. By morning, I'd made a decision. I would drive to Seattle, where my parents lived and ran the family business. I'd confront them directly, force them to acknowledge what they'd done. But first, I needed more information. I remembered that my name was still on several of the family's shared accounts, digital remnants from when they'd helped me manage my college expenses. They'd never bothered to remove my access, probably assuming I wouldn't be interested in their financial dealings. It was time to test that assumption. Logging into the family's shared cloud drive felt strangely transgressive, like reading someone else's diary. But these weren't just someone else's accounts. This was my family, my inheritance, my future they'd decided without me. What I found shocked me beyond the lake house sale. There were documents detailing extensive investments in a new development project, the kind my father had been chasing for years, a luxury retirement community that would be his crowning achievement. The lake house money hadn't gone toward early retirement at all. It had been channeled directly into this new venture, along with what appeared to be their entire retirement savings. My father, always cautious to a fault, had gone all in on a single project, and from what I could tell reviewing the prospectus, it was dangerously over-leveraged. One market downturn, one construction delay, one permit issue, and everything, absolutely everything, would collapse. They hadn't just sold my inheritance, they'd potentially risked their own financial security in the process. The cruel irony wasn't lost on me. They'd sold the lake house for security, but had immediately endangered that security with a risky investment. I dug deeper, downloading documents, taking screenshots of bank transfers. With each new discovery, my anger transformed into something more complex. These weren't the careful, measured decisions my parents had always prided themselves on. This looked like desperation, like fear. By the time I arrived in Seattle 2 days later, my approach had changed. I didn't want a confrontation. I wanted answers. I booked a room at a hotel downtown rather than staying at their house, a small act of independence that felt significant. I texted my mother, "In town for a few days. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? Just us?" Her response came quickly. "Of course, darling. Everything all right? The Evergreen Brew at 10? The Evergreen Brew was an upscale coffee shop in the business district, carefully neutral territory. When I arrived, my mother was already there, immaculately dressed as always, her silver blonde hair perfectly styled. She stood to embrace me, her perfume enveloping me in a cloud of familiarity that made my chest ache. "Alexandra, you look tired," she said, studying my face with a frown. "Are you eating properly? Portland's weather can be so dreary this time of year." "I'm fine, Mom," I said, settling into the chair across from her. "Just been busy with job applications." We went through the ritual of ordering, a latte for her, black coffee for me, and exchanged pleasantries about the weather, about my brother's recent promotion, about her garden club's upcoming fundraiser. All the while, I was watching her closely, looking for signs of the stress I'd expect from someone who'd just gambled their retirement on a risky venture. "Mom," I finally said during a lull, "I want to talk about the lake house." Her smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Oh, Alexandra, I know you were fond of the place, but your father and I simply couldn't justify keeping it. The property taxes alone were becoming prohibitive." "It's not just about selling it," I said carefully. "It's about not discussing it with me first. It's about promises that were made." "Promises?" She raised an eyebrow. "Your grandfather left that property to your father, not to you, dear. I know you have fond memories." "It's more than memories. Grandpa told me, all of us, that the lake house would stay in the family, that it would pass to me and Michael." "Your grandfather said a lot of things," my mother replied, a hint of dismissiveness creeping into her tone. "But legally, the property belonged to your father, and we needed the liquidity for our retirement plans." "For retirement," I repeated. "Or for the Lakeside Pines development?" Her coffee cup paused halfway to her lips. A slight widening of her eyes confirmed what I'd suspected. My father hadn't fully consulted her either. She'd been told one story, while he pursued another. "How do you know about Lakeside Pines?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "I did some research," I said, deliberately vague. "It seems like Dad's put a lot of resources into this project. A lot of your resources." "Your father knows what he's doing," she said automatically, but I could see a new tension in the set of her shoulders. "Robert has been in development for 30 years. And how many projects has he had fail in those 30 years?" I asked. "That's business," she said sharply. "You take risks, some pay off, some don't. That's something you might understand if you'd shown any interest in the family company." There it was again, the implication that my career choices had somehow disqualified me from having a say in family matters. But I wasn't going to be diverted this time. "Mom, have you looked at the financial projections for Lakeside Pines? Have you seen the amount of debt Dad's taking on? This isn't just a normal business risk." She set her cup down with a sharp click. "I don't appreciate being interrogated about your father's business decisions. Robert has always provided for this family, and he will continue to do so. Even if it means selling off family heirlooms without discussion? Even if it means risking everything on one project?" "You're being dramatic," she said, but there was uncertainty in her eyes now. "Your father would never put us at risk." "Maybe not intentionally," I conceded. "But have you actually looked at the numbers? Or did you just trust him because that's what you've always done?" My mother's face flushed. She'd always been the supportive spouse, handling the social connections while my father handled the finances. It was an arrangement that had worked for their generation, but suddenly I could see how it had left her vulnerable. "I think this conversation is over," she said, gathering her purse. "If you have concerns about your father's business, you should speak to him directly." "I intend to," I said, "but I wanted to give you a chance to be involved." because whatever happens next is going to affect both of you." She paused, half risen from her chair. "Is that some kind of threat?" "No, Mom. It's a warning, and it comes from a place of love, even if you don't believe that right now." As she left, her back rigid with indignation, I felt a strange mix of guilt and determination. I hadn't meant to upset her, but I also couldn't stand by while my father potentially drove them toward financial disaster. The lake house had been just the beginning. If I was right about Lakeside Pines, they stood to lose everything: their savings, their home, their retirement security. That evening, in my hotel room, I made a call to Eleanor Bennett, a lawyer, who had worked with my grandfather years ago. She'd always treated me with respect, even when I was just a kid tagging along to meetings. "Alexandra Mitchell," she said warmly when she picked up. "It's been a while. How are you?" "I've been better," I admitted. "I need some advice and I need absolute discretion." "Always," she promised. "What's going on?" I explained the situation, the lake house sale, the documents I'd found, my concerns about my father's investment strategy. As I spoke, I could hear her taking notes. "Let me get this straight," she said when I finished. "You're concerned that your parents have invested the proceeds from the lake house sale, along with their retirement funds, into a single high-risk development project?" "Yes, and I need to know what options I have to protect them, even if it's from themselves." "That's complicated," she said slowly. "They're competent adults making their own financial decisions. Legally, you don't have many options to intervene. Directly?" My heart sank. "So there's nothing I can do?" "I didn't say that," she replied. "You mentioned you still have access to some family accounts?" "Yes, digital access my parents never revoked." "That's a start." "And you said your grandfather had specific wishes regarding the lake property?" "He always said it would stay in the family, that it would pass to the grandchildren." "Was that ever documented? In his will or elsewhere?" I thought back to the family meetings after my grandfather's death. "Maybe. There were letters he left for each of us. Mine mentioned the lake house." "Find that letter," she advised, "and any other documentation about your grandfather's wishes. In the meantime, I'll look into whether there are grounds for challenging the sale based on intent." It wasn't much, but it was a start. After we hung up, I opened my laptop and began creating a more organized record of everything I'd found. If I was going to challenge my father, a man who had built his career on outmaneuvering opponents, I needed to be thoroughly prepared. The next morning, I received a text from my father. "Your mother says you have concerns about the business. My office, 2 p.m. It wasn't a request. It was a summons." The old me would have acquiesced, would have shown up prepared to be lectured about matters I supposedly didn't understand. But I wasn't that person anymore. I replied, "Can't make 2 p.m. I'll be at your house at 7 for dinner. We can talk then. This should involve both you and Mom." His response was terse. "Fine. Don't be late." That gave me several hours to continue my research and preparation. I contacted Jordan Williams, my parents' financial advisor, using my mother's email address, which was still in my phone from years ago when I'd helped her set up her accounts. "Jordan, I'd like to review our current portfolio allocation, particularly regarding the Lakeside Pines investment. Can you send me the most recent prospectus and risk assessment? Thanks, Linda Mitchell." It was a risk, impersonating my mother via email, but one I was willing to take. Jordan had always been more my father's advisor than my mother's. I doubted. He'd question the request. Sure enough, within an hour, a comprehensive set of documents arrived in my mother's inbox, which forwarded automatically to mine. Another digital connection from years ago that had never been severed. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. The Lakeside Pines development wasn't just risky. It was teetering on the edge of collapse before it had even broken ground. Environmental surveys had raised concerns about wetland protection. Local community, Groups were organizing against the development. And most concerning of all, the primary lender was getting cold feet, threatening to pull their commitment if certain benchmarks weren't met by the end of the quarter. My father had thrown my parents' life savings and the proceeds from my inheritance into a project that had maybe a 20% chance of success. And from the communications I could see, he was in denial about the severity of the problems. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing a presentation, not the kind of slick marketing materials I'd created in my previous career, but something more direct. Printouts of the most concerning documents, a timeline of decisions made, projections of what would happen if the project failed. By the time I arrived at my parents' Bellevue home that evening, I was armed with knowledge, with evidence, and with a determination that surprised even me. This wasn't just about the lake house anymore. This was about preventing a disaster that would affect all of us. My mother answered the door, her smile tight and uncertain. "Alexandra, come in. Your father's in his study on a call. He'll join us shortly." The house I'd grown up in felt simultaneously familiar and foreign, like returning to a place you've only seen in dreams. Family photos lined the hallway, carefully curated images of success and unity that told a very selective story of who we were. "Would you like something to drink?" my mother asked, leading me to the living room. "Wine? Water?" "Water is fine," I said, setting my messenger bag on the coffee table. "How are you, Mom? Really?" She glanced toward my father's closed study door before answering. "I'm fine. Busy with the garden club and volunteer work. Your father's been working long hours on this new project, but that's nothing new." "Has he talked to you about any of the challenges with Lakeside Pines?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. "He mentioned some minor permitting issues, but that's normal for any development." "Why?" Before I could answer, my father's study door opened, and Robert Mitchell strode into the living room. At 62, he still had the commanding presence that had intimidated business rivals and his own children in equal measure. His dark hair was now more salt than pepper, but his sharp blue eyes hadn't lost any of their intensity. "Alexandra," he said, giving me a perfunctory hug. "Your mother says you've been asking questions about my business. I have to say it's a surprising new interest from you." There was an edge to his voice, a combination of condescension and wariness that I'd heard many times before. It had always made me feel small. Not tonight. "It became my interest when you sold the lake house to fund it," I said evenly. "A house that was supposed to stay in the family." He dismissed this with a wave. "That old place was becoming a liability. Property taxes, maintenance, insurance. It was draining resources that could be better used elsewhere." "Like in Lakeside Pines?" I asked. "How's that investment working out?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Business investments have ups and downs. That's not something I'd expect you to understand, given your career choices." "Robert," my mother interjected, "let's not start the evening with arguments. Alexandra came for dinner." "Actually," I said, reaching for my bag, "I came for a conversation, an important one." I pulled out a folder and set it on the coffee table. "We need to talk about what's happening with your retirement funds and the Lakeside Pines development." My father's face hardened. "And what exactly would you know about either of those things?" "More than you think," I said, opening the folder. "I know that the project is facing serious environmental challenges. I know that the main lender is threatening to pull out. I know that you've invested not just the lake house money, but nearly all of your retirement savings into this one high-risk venture." The color drained from my mother's face. "Robert, is this true?" My father shot me a look of pure anger. "Where did you get this information?" "That's not important right now," I said. "What's important is that you've put everything at risk. Your savings, your retirement, your future. And you did it without consulting Mom, without being honest about the level of risk." "This is absurd," he snapped. "I've been in this business for decades. I know what I'm doing. Do you? I slid a document across the table, the latest communication from the project's environmental consultants, because this suggests otherwise. The wetland issue isn't going away. The community opposition is growing. And if the primary lender pulls out, the whole thing collapses. My mother picked up the document with trembling hands. Robert, what is this? You told me everything was proceeding on schedule. It is, he insisted, but I could see the first cracks in his confident facade. There are always complications in development. I've navigated worse. Not with your entire retirement fund on the line, I countered. Not with Mom's future security at stake. He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. I don't have to justify my business decisions to you. Alexandra, you chose to walk away from the family business years ago. This isn't about the family business, I said. This is about family, period. About trust and honesty. Like the honesty you showed accessing private financial information without permission, he shot back. I shouldn't have had to go behind your back to learn that you've gambled away my inheritance and potentially your own security, I said, remaining calm despite the anger building inside me. The lake house wasn't just a property to liquidate. It was Grandpa's legacy. It was supposed to stay in the family. Your grandfather would have understood making tough business decisions, my father said dismissively. Would he? I reached into my bag again and pulled out a worn envelope. Because in the letter he left me after he died, he specifically said that the lake house should never leave the family, that it was meant to pass to his grandchildren. My mother looked up sharply. You never showed us that letter. You never asked, I replied simply. Just like you never asked how I might feel about selling the place where I scattered part of his ashes. The place where he taught me to fish and build a fire. The place that meant everything to me. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in my father's eyes. Alexandra, business decisions can't be based on sentiment. No, I agreed. They should be based on sound judgment and honest risk assessment, neither of which seems to have happened with Lakeside Pines. I turned to my mother. Mom, did you know that Dad has leveraged your house as additional collateral for this project? Her face went completely pale. Our house? Robert, tell me that's not true. My father's silence was answer enough. If Lakeside Pines fails, I continued, you lose everything. Not just the lake house money, everything. The revelation hung, in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. My mother covered her mouth with her hand, eyes wide with shock. My father's shoulders slumped, the carefully maintained facade of the successful businessman crumbling before my eyes. I was trying to secure our future, he finally said, his voice uncharacteristically quiet. To build something that would set us all up for generations. Something bigger than a vacation home. By risking everything we already had? My mother asked, her voice trembling. Without even discussing it with me? I didn't want to worry you, he said. But the excuse sounded hollow even to him, I could tell. I've always handled the finances. I've always made the right calls. Until now, I said, not unkindly. Dad, this isn't just a bad investment. This is a potential disaster, and we need to act now if we're going to salvage anything. He looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time seeing not his little girl but a capable adult. What would you suggest? It was the first time he'd ever asked for my input on anything business-related. The moment should have felt victorious, but instead, I just felt sad for all the years we'd wasted with him refusing to see my value. First, we need to pull back whatever funds we still can, I said, moving to sit beside my mother on the couch. Second, we need to be transparent with all parties involved about the challenges the project is facing. And third, I paused, meeting my father's eyes. We need to look at whether there's a legal basis for unwinding the lake house sale based on Grandpa's documented wishes. You want to undo the sale? My father asked incredulously. That's impossible. Not necessarily, I said. I've been consulting with Eleanor Bennett. You went to Eleanor? My father's face registered genuine surprise. Behind my back? Just like you sold my inheritance behind mine, I countered. But this isn't about getting even, Dad. This is about trying to fix a situation before it gets worse. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then my mother reached out and took my hand, squeezing it tightly. Alexandra has always been the most level-headed of us all, she said to my father. Maybe it's time we listened. The weeks that followed were some of the most exhausting and intense of my life. With Eleanor Bennett's help, we discovered that my grandfather had indeed included specific provisions in his estate planning documents regarding the lake house. While he'd left the property to my father, there were conditions attached, namely that it remain in the family for at least 2 generations. Based on this, Eleanor was able to challenge the sale, arguing that my father had breached the terms of his inheritance by selling the property. The legal battle was complex and draining, but it gave us leverage. Leverage we desperately needed as the Lakeside Pines project continued to unravel. Meanwhile, I worked with my father to extricate as much of their investment as possible from the failing development. It wasn't easy. My father had to swallow his pride, admit to partners and investors that he'd overreached, and accept significant financial losses. But with each difficult conversation, each painful concession, we were pulling my parents back from the brink of complete financial ruin. My mother, once she got over the initial shock, became an unexpected ally. Years of social connections and community involvement had given her relationships that proved invaluable as we navigated the mess. She was the one who approached the buyers of the lake house, explaining the situation with a grace I couldn't have managed. Surprisingly, the couple, who had purchased the property, were sympathetic. They had bought it as an investment, not as a primary residence, and when presented with the legal complications and the family history, they agreed to a settlement. They would keep a portion of the lakefront land where they planned to build a new home, but would sell the original cabin and most of the surrounding acreage back to our family at a significant discount from what they'd paid. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a compromise that allowed us to reclaim the heart of what mattered: the cabin itself, the gardens where my grandfather's ashes were scattered, the dock where I'd spent countless summer days. The financial toll was still substantial. My parents had to downsize, selling their Bellevue home and moving to a smaller place. My father had to face the failure of his dream project and the humiliation of scaling back his role in the company he'd built. But they were spared the complete devastation that would have come if Lakeside Pines had been allowed to collapse while still holding their entire financial future. As for me, I found something unexpected in the midst of all this turmoil: my place in the family business. Not in the role my father had always envisioned for me, but in a new position that utilized my marketing background and my newly discovered talent for crisis management. Mitchell Commercial Development was evolving, becoming more collaborative, more transparent, and, ironically, more successful as a result. 6 months after that pivotal dinner at my parents' house, we gathered at the lake house, our lake house once again. The property was smaller now, the neighboring lot already under construction for the new owner's home, but the cabin stood just as it always had, the porch overlooking the water, the garden blooming with early spring flowers. My father and I sat on the dock, watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and pink. We'd spent the day cleaning up, making small repairs, preparing the place for summer. My mother was inside, arranging the kitchen back to her liking. "I never thought I'd sit here again," my father admitted, his voice soft with something that might have been regret. "Neither did I said. "But here we are." He looked over at me, the harsh lines of his face softened by the evening light. "You saved us, you know, not just the lake house, everything." I shook my head. "We saved each other. That's what family does, even when they're driving each other crazy." He laughed, a genuine laugh without the edge of condescension that had colored so much of our relationship. Your grandfather would be proud of you. He always said you had his business sense, even when you were just a little girl selling painted rocks to the neighbors. I wish I'd known that, I said. I always thought you were disappointed that I didn't want to join the family business. I was, he admitted. But not because I didn't respect your choices, because I missed you. The business was the only way. I knew how to keep family close. It was perhaps the most honest thing my father had ever said to me. And in that moment, I realized that what I'd gained through this ordeal wasn't just the lake house or a new role in the family business. It was understanding of my parents, of myself, of the complex tangle of love and expectation that binds families together. The lake house had come back to us, changed but intact, just like our relationship. And as we sat there watching the light fade from the sky, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel when this all began. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but the peace of reconciliation. Some betrayals can't be undone. Some can only be understood, acknowledged, and then used as the foundation for something new. My parents had sold our vacation home without telling me, and in doing so, had nearly lost everything that mattered. But in revealing where their retirement fund had gone, and in fighting to save what could be saved, I hadn't just reclaimed my inheritance. I'd found my place in the family story, and that, I realized, was worth more than any property could ever be. I left my parents' house that night with my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel of my rental car. The weight of what I'd uncovered pressed down on me like a physical force. My father's face, that moment when his carefully constructed facade had crumbled, kept flashing in my mind. For the first time in my adult life, I'd seen fear in Robert Mitchell's eyes. Back at my hotel room, I spread the documents across the bed, creating a timeline of my father's decisions regarding Lakeside Pines. The picture that emerged was troubling. The project had started reasonably enough, a luxury retirement community on a prime piece of real estate north of Seattle. My father had initially invested a modest amount, diversifying risk among several partners. But as problems arose, environmental concerns, community pushback, regulatory hurdles, the other investors had begun pulling back. Rather than recognizing these warning signs, my father had doubled down. Each time a partner reduced their stake, he increased his. When funding gaps appeared, he filled them, first with business reserves, then with personal savings, and finally with the proceeds from the lake house. He'd been chasing losses, behaving more like a desperate gambler than the shrewd businessman he'd always prided himself on being. I picked up my phone and called Taylor, who answered on the second ring despite the late hour. "How did it go?" she asked, skipping any greeting. "Worse than I imagined," I said, leaning back against the headboard. "They haven't just sold the lake house, Taylor. Dad's put everything they have into this development project, and it's failing." "Everything? Like retirement, savings, all of it?" "And their house. He used it as collateral." I rubbed my eyes, feeling the exhaustion of the day hitting me all at once. "Mom didn't even know. She thought the lake house money was going into safe retirement investments." Taylor's sharp intake of breath was audible. "Alex, what are you going to do?" "I don't know yet," I admitted. Part of me wants to wash my hands of the whole thing. They made their choices, right? But they're still your parents, Taylor finished for me. "Yeah." I stared at the ceiling, conflicted. "And if this project goes under, they lose everything. Dad's 62, Mom's 60. They can't start over at this point." "Neither can you," Taylor reminded me gently. "You just lost your job. You're in your own crisis." She was right, of course. The logical move would be to distance myself, to let my parents face the consequences of my father's reckless decisions. But something in me couldn't accept that ending. "I think I need to help them," I said, surprising myself with the conviction in my voice. Not for Dad's sake, or even for the lake house anymore. But Mom doesn't deserve to lose everything because Dad got in over his head. So what's the plan? Taylor asked. I'm not sure yet, but whatever it is, it needs to involve getting them out of Lakeside Pines with as much of their investment as possible, and it needs to happen fast. After we hung up, I focused on the most pressing documents, the latest communications from lenders, the environmental impact reports, the community objection filings. A pattern began to emerge, and with it, the seed of a plan. I drafted an email to Eleanor Bennett, outlining what I'd discovered and asking for a meeting first thing in the morning. Then I researched the buyers of the lake house, a couple named James and Catherine Thornton. He was a tech executive. She ran a successful interior design business. They had no children and had purchased the lake house as a second home, a weekend retreat from their primary residence in Seattle. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Alexandra, I hope you made it back to your hotel safely. Your father and I have been talking. Can we meet tomorrow? There's more to discuss. I replied that I'd be there at noon, then tried to get some sleep. But rest eluded me as my mind kept cycling through scenarios, possibilities, risks. By dawn, I had the outline of a strategy. Risky, requiring several pieces to fall perfectly into place, but potentially a way to extract my parents from disaster without completely destroying their future. Eleanor Bennett's office was in a converted, Victorian house in one of Seattle's older neighborhoods. She welcomed me with a firm handshake and sharp eyes that missed nothing. You look like you haven't slept, she observed, gesturing for me to take a seat across from her desk. That obvious? I managed a wry smile. Sleep deprivation is a familiar companion in my profession, she said. Tell me what's happened since we last spoke. I laid out everything I'd discovered, the extent of my father's investment in Lakeside Pines, the leveraging of their home, the looming collapse of the project, and my mother's lack of awareness about the true state of their finances. Eleanor listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When I finished, she sat back in her chair, fingers steepled beneath her chin. Your father has put himself, and your mother, in an extremely vulnerable position, she said finally. If Lakeside Pines fails, as seems increasingly likely, they stand to lose nearly everything. Can we stop that from happening? I asked. Possibly. She picked up a pen, tapping it thoughtfully against her desk. Your grandfather's provisions regarding the lake house give us leverage there. We could potentially challenge the sale on those grounds, though it would be a complicated case. Would we have to go to court? That could take months, right? Most likely, yes, she agreed. That said, sometimes the mere threat of litigation is enough to bring parties to the negotiating table. The Thorntons might be willing to discuss a settlement rather than face a protracted legal battle, especially if they learn about the conditions attached to the property. What about the rest of it? Dad's investment in Lakeside Pines? Eleanor's expression grew more serious. That's more challenging. Your father entered into those agreements as a competent adult. Unless there was fraud on the part of his partners or the developers, he's legally bound by the terms he agreed to. I nodded, having expected as much. What if we could demonstrate that the project is no longer viable? That continuing would only compound losses for all involved? That would depend on the specific terms of the partnership agreements and investment contracts, she said. Do you have access to those documents? Not yet, I admitted, but I could get them. Do that, she advised. In the meantime, I'll begin preparing a case regarding the lake house. Having that as leverage may prove useful in the broader strategy. As I left Eleanor's office, my phone rang. It was Jordan Williams, my parents' financial advisor. Ms. Mitchell? He sounded uncertain. I received an email from your mother yesterday requesting information about Lakeside Pines. I sent the documents, but I wanted to follow up. Is everything all right? I hesitated, weighing my options. Jordan had been my father's advisor for years. His loyalty would likely lie with my father, not with me. But he was also a professional with fiduciary responsibilities. Actually, Jordan, I sent that email, I admitted. I was concerned about the extent of my parents' investment in Lakeside Pines and wanted to understand the situation better. There was a pause. I see, he said carefully. That's irregular, Alexandra. I can't discuss your parents' finances without their permission. I understand that, I said. And I apologize for the deception. But I've since spoken with both my parents, and what I've discovered is concerning. My father has invested far, more than is prudent in a single high-risk venture, and my mother wasn't fully aware of the extent of their exposure. Another pause, longer this time. Your father is an experienced businessman, he said finally. He understands risk. Does he? I countered. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like he's gambling with their entire future on a project that's showing multiple warning signs of failure. What exactly are you asking me to do, Alexandra? Meet with me, I said. Let me show you what I've found. If I'm wrong, tell me so. If I'm right, help me figure out how to limit the damage before it's too late. After a moment's consideration, he agreed to meet me at a coffee shop near my parents' house. I had an hour before I needed to be at their home, just enough time for a brief conversation with Jordan. The coffee shop was busy, providing a buffer of noise that would make our conversation harder to overhear. Jordan was already there when I arrived, a slim man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually concerned expression. Alexandra, he greeted me, rising slightly as I approached. It's been some time. Thanks for meeting me, I said, setting my bag on the chair beside me. I know this is an unusual situation. Indeed. He fidgeted with his coffee cup. I should be clear, I cannot and will not violate client confidentiality. I respect that, I assured him. But as you know, this involves my mother as well, and she was not fully informed about these financial decisions. I pulled out a folder with the key documents I'd gathered, sliding it across the table. Take a look at these. They're the most recent reports on Lakeside Pines, the environmental issues, the community opposition, the lenders' concerns. This project is in serious trouble, Jordan. He reluctantly opened the folder, scanning the contents with a professional's eye. I watched his expression change subtly as he read, a frown here, a slight widening of the eyes there. Where did you get these? He asked finally. That's not important, I said. What matters is whether they're accurate. You've been advising my father on this investment. You must know if what these documents show is true. He closed the folder, pushing it back toward me. I can't comment specifically on your father's investments. Jordan, I leaned forward, keeping my voice low but intense. My parents stand to lose everything, their savings, their home, their retirement security. As their financial advisor, don't you have some responsibility to protect them from excessive risk? A flicker of discomfort crossed his face. I advise, Alexandra. I don't control how clients ultimately choose to allocate their resources. Did you advise my father to put everything into Lakeside Pines? No, he admitted after a pause. I recommended a more diversified approach. And when he ignored that advice? When he kept increasing his stake despite mounting evidence of problems? I expressed concerns, he said carefully. Your father was confident in his assessment of the situation. Too confident, I said. And now they're on the brink of financial ruin. Jordan removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. What do you want from me, Alexandra? Help me convince my father to extract as much of their investment as possible before it's too late. You've been his advisor for years. He trusts your judgment even if he sometimes ignores it. If we both make the case, maybe he'll listen. He put his glasses back on, studying me with new interest. You're not what I expected, he said finally. What did you expect? Based on what your father has said over the years, someone less pragmatic, less concerned with the family's financial well-being. I felt a flash of irritation. Of course, my father had painted me as the irresponsible one, the child who'd chosen a different path. People aren't always what others describe them to be, I said evenly. Evidently not. He checked his watch. I need to go, but I'll think about what you've said. If I determine that intervention is appropriate, I'll reach out. It wasn't the firm commitment I'd hoped for, but it was something. As Jordan left, I ordered another coffee, using the remaining time to prepare for my next confrontation with my parents. The Mitchell family home looked different in the daylight, smaller somehow, less imposing than it had seemed the night before. My mother answered the door before I could ring the bell, as if she'd been watching for my arrival. "Alexandra," she greeted me, her voice tight with tension. "Thank you for coming." Inside, the living room had been transformed into what looked like a war room. Papers covered the coffee table, folders were stacked on chairs, and my father was standing before a whiteboard that hadn't been there yesterday, writing figures and notes in his precise handwriting. "You're here," he said without turning. "Good. We have a lot to discuss." The shift in his demeanor was startling. Gone was the defensive, angry man from last night. In his place was the methodical businessman I remembered from childhood, the one who tackled problems with ruthless efficiency. "I've been reviewing the Lakeside Pines situation," he continued, finally facing me. "You were right about several of the concerns, though I think you've overstated the risk in other areas." Coming from my father, this was tantamount to a full confession of error. I glanced at my mother, who gave me a small, tight smile. "We were up most of the night," she explained. "After you left, Robert showed me everything. All the reports, all the numbers. It's not good." "No," I agreed, setting my bag down. "It's not, but it's not unsalvageable either, if we act quickly." My father raised an eyebrow. "We?" "Yes, we," I said firmly. "This affects all of us, and fixing it will require all of us." He studied me for a moment, then nodded once, briskly. "Fair enough. I assume you've been developing your own assessment." I pulled out my notes and documents, adding them to the collection on the coffee table. "I have. I've also spoken with Eleanor Bennett about the lake house situation." My father's expression darkened. "Alexandra—" "Robert," my mother interrupted, her voice unusually firm. "Let her speak. We agreed to listen." It was a small moment, but a revealing one. The dynamics in my parents' relationship were shifting, perhaps for the first time in their long marriage. I outlined what I'd learned from Eleanor about my grandfather's provisions regarding the lake house and the potential leverage that gave us in challenging the sale. My father listened without interrupting, making occasional notes. "It's a long shot," he said when I finished. "Property law is complex, and the sale has already been completed." "The legal merits aren't the only consideration," I pointed out. "The Thorntons might be willing to negotiate rather than face a protracted legal battle, especially if they understand the sentimental value of the property to our family." "Perhaps," he conceded. "But even if we could recover some value from the lake house, it wouldn't be enough to offset the Lakeside Pines situation." "No," I agreed. "That requires a different approach." I turned to the whiteboard, studying his notes. "You've started analyzing which parts of the investment might still be recoverable." "Yes," he sighed. "It's not encouraging. The main lender is on the verge of pulling out, which would trigger a cascade of problems. Most of the other investors have already minimized their exposure, and the environmental issues—" He gestured to a stack of reports. "Those are even worse than initially reported." "What about the land itself?" I asked. "Even if the current development plan isn't viable, the property must have value." "Some," he acknowledged, "but significantly less than what's been invested, and selling now would mean accepting a substantial loss." "A loss is better than a complete write-off," I pointed out. And the longer this continues, the more money gets poured into a failing project. My mother, who had been quietly listening, finally spoke up. What about the heritage angle? We both turned to look at her. The what? My father asked. The heritage angle, she repeated. The environmental reports show concerns about wetland destruction, yes? And the community opposition is largely based on changing the character of the area, destroying natural habitat? That's part of it, I confirmed, intrigued by where she might be going with this. What if, she said slowly, instead of fighting those concerns, we embrace them? What if Lakeside Pines wasn't a luxury retirement community but a conservation project? A nature preserve with limited environmentally sustainable housing? My father started to dismiss the idea, then paused, considering. The regulatory hurdles would be different, potentially less restrictive. And the community opposition might transform into community support, I added, seeing the potential. Plus, conservation projects can attract different types of funding: grants, public-private partnerships, tax incentives. My mother nodded. I sit on the board of the Northwest Conservation Trust. They've been looking to expand their protected wetland holdings in exactly that region. I stared at her with new respect. My mother, whom I'd always seen as a society wife supporting my father's business ventures from the sidelines, had just offered a potential lifeline. It would mean completely reimagining the project, my father said, but I could hear the consideration in his voice. Starting over in many ways. Not starting over, I corrected. Evolving. Adapting to the realities on the ground instead of fighting against them. He turned back to the whiteboard, erasing some figures and writing new ones. The return would be lower, much lower than originally projected. But more secure, I pointed out. And with different partners and funding sources, you could reduce your personal exposure significantly. It might work, he admitted grudgingly. Though it would take time to restructure everything. Time we may not have if the current lender pulls out. Then we need a bridge, I said. Something to buy us time while we develop this new approach. My mother reached for her phone. I can call Elizabeth Hartford at the trust today, get a preliminary read on their interest. My father and I exchanged glances, both slightly taken aback by my mother's sudden assertiveness. What? She said, noticing our expressions. I've been managing relationships and serving on boards for 30 years. Did you think I was just planning charity galas all this time? The hint of a smile touched my father's face, the first I'd seen since arriving in Seattle. No, Linda, I never thought that. My mother made her call in the other room while my father and I continued analyzing the financial aspects of a potential pivot to conservation-focused development. It was strange, working alongside him as a peer rather than as his daughter. Stranger still was realizing that I had insights and skills that complemented his own. My marketing background gave me perspective on how to reposition the project. His decades of development experience provided practical knowledge of what would and wouldn't work. When my mother returned, her expression was cautiously optimistic. Elizabeth is intrigued. She wants to see the environmental reports and meet to discuss possibilities next week. Next week might be too late, my father said, running a hand through his silver hair. Brandon at First Northwest Bank has been making noise about calling their loan. If they do, everything unravels. Can you buy time with them? I asked. Just enough to explore this new direction? He shook his head. They've lost confidence. They want out. A thought occurred to me. What if someone else bought their position? Someone who understood the new vision and was willing to be patient while we restructured. In theory, yes, but who? The other investors are already skittish. No one's looking to increase their exposure at this point. I took a deep breath. What about the Thorntons? The lake house buyers? My father looked confused. What about them? James Thornton is the CEO of Green Tech Solutions. Their whole business model is built around sustainable technology and environmental responsibility. This kind of project, a conservation-focused development, would align perfectly with their corporate values. My father's eyes narrowed as he considered this. Even if that's true, why would they get involved? They don't know us. No, I agreed. But they just bought our family's historic lake house, a property that, as it turns out, came with certain family legacy provisions they may not have been aware of. Understanding dawned on my father's face. You're suggesting we use the threat of legal action over the lake house to pressure them into investing in lakeside pines? Not pressure, I corrected carefully. Offer an opportunity. A way to resolve the lake house situation amicably, while also making a potentially valuable investment in a project that aligns with their values. That's, my father started, then stopped, reassessing. Actually, that's not bad. It's complex. Requires multiple pieces to fall into place, but it could work. It's still a risk, my mother pointed out. If they refuse, we've shown our hand regarding the lake house challenge. True, I acknowledged. But from what I've researched about the Thorntons, they prefer negotiation to confrontation. And this approach gives them a way to be part of the solution rather than just the target of a lawsuit. My father paced the room, thinking it through. We'd need to present it carefully, not as a threat, but as a mutually beneficial partnership. Exactly, I said. They get to resolve the lake house situation cleanly, potentially retain part of the property they wanted, and gain an investment opportunity in a conservation project with significant PR value for green tech. And we get a new lead investor. To replace the bank? Time to restructure the project around conservation, and potentially a resolution to the lake house situation that honors Grandpa's wishes, my mother added. For the first time since this crisis began, I felt a flicker of genuine hope. It was a complex plan with many moving parts, but it had the potential to address all aspects of the problem simultaneously. We'd need to approach them very carefully, my father said. The sequencing would be critical. I think Mom should make the initial contact, I suggested. Frame it as one new lake house owner reaching out to another, a personal connection rather than a business one. My mother nodded. I could invite Catherine for coffee, mention that we've discovered some family history connected to the property that we'd like to share. Meanwhile, I'll work with Eleanor to prepare the legal documentation regarding Grandpa's provisions, but hold off on filing anything, I added. And I'll develop a comprehensive proposal for the conservation pivot, my father said, already thinking ahead. Financial projections, regulatory considerations, potential partnerships with groups like your conservation trust. We spent the rest of the afternoon refining the strategy, identifying potential obstacles, developing contingency plans. It was exhausting, intense work, but also strangely exhilarating. For perhaps the first time in my adult life, I felt like my father was seeing me, really seeing me, as a capable, valuable partner, rather than just his headstrong daughter who'd chosen the wrong career path. As evening approached, my mother ordered dinner to be delivered, and we continued working through the meal. The initial shock and anger had transformed into focused determination, a united front against a threat to our family's future. There's one more thing we need to discuss, my father said as we were finishing. Your brother, Michael. In all the chaos, I'd almost forgotten about him. He needs to be involved, I agreed. This affects his inheritance too. Yes, my father said, carefully. But Michael can be reactive. If he feels threatened or blindsided, he might make this more complicated. That was putting it mildly. My brother had always been more emotionally volatile than me, quicker to anger and slower to forgive. He'd also always been more enmeshed in family dynamics, working for my father since college, never establishing the independence I had. I'll talk to him, I offered. Explain everything. Make sure he understands that we're working toward a solution that protects everyone's interests. My father nodded, looking relieved. Thank you. He's more likely to listen to you than to me right now. Things have been tense at the office lately. Another revelation. I'd assumed Michael and my father were as aligned as ever. What happened? I asked. My father sighed. Michael wanted more responsibility, a larger role in decision-making. I was resistant. In retrospect, perhaps if I'd been more willing to share control, to listen to other perspectives, we wouldn't be in this situation. It was as close to an admission of error as I'd ever heard from him. Progress, of a sort. I'll call him tonight, I promised. Set up a time to meet tomorrow. As I prepared to leave, gathering my notes and documents, my mother pulled me aside in the hallway. Alexandra, she said softly, I want you to know how much it means to me that you're helping us. After everything, the lake house, your father's decisions, you would have every right to walk away. I thought about it, I admitted, but that wouldn't solve anything. And despite everything, you're still my family. She hugged me then, a real hug, not the perfunctory embrace we'd exchanged in recent years. When did you become so wise? She asked, her voice thick with emotion. I had good teachers, I said, even when I didn't realize what I was learning. Back at my hotel, I called Michael, preparing myself for a difficult conversation. But to my surprise, he answered with unusual warmth. Alex, he said, I was going to call you. Dad told me what's been happening, about Lakeside Pines, about your ideas for saving the situation. He did? I hadn't expected my father to reach out to Michael so quickly. Yeah, he actually... Michael paused. He said I should listen to you, that you've shown remarkable insight and judgment. That's not something I hear from him often. For either of us, I said, still processing this development. True. He laughed, a short, slightly bitter sound. Look, can we meet tomorrow? Talk. Through this whole mess properly? Absolutely, I agreed, relieved that at least this part of the plan was going smoothly. Breakfast? Perfect. That diner near the office we used to go to after school, 8 o'clock? I'll be there. But after hanging up, I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, emotionally and mentally drained but oddly energized. In just 24 hours, the dynamics of my family had shifted dramatically. Old patterns were breaking down, new alliances forming. It was disorienting but also liberating. My phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. Researched the grandfather's provisions. Stronger than expected. Meeting tomorrow to discuss strategy? I confirmed our meeting for the afternoon, then lay back, staring at the ceiling. So much had happened. So much was still uncertain. The plan we'd developed was full of potential pitfalls and dependent on people making decisions we couldn't control. Yet despite all that, I felt more connected to my family than I had in years. The crisis had forced conversations we'd been avoiding, revealed truths we'd been hiding, and created space for new understanding. Whatever happened with the lake house, with Lakeside Pines, with my parents' retirement, something valuable had already been salvaged from the wreckage. A chance to rebuild relationships that had been slowly crumbling for years. That night, I slept soundly for the first time since Taylor's call about the lake house. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new potential for both success and failure. But tonight, at least, I could rest, knowing that we were facing those challenges together, as a family. The diner looked exactly as I remembered it. Faded red vinyl booths, slightly sticky laminate tables, and the comforting smell of coffee. And bacon that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. When we were teenagers, Michael and I would come here after school, splitting plates of cheese fries and complaining about our parents. Michael was already there when I arrived, occupying our old favorite booth in the corner. At 35, my brother still had the same dark hair and Mitchell blue eyes as our father. though premature stress lines had begun to form around his mouth. He stood when he saw me, offering an awkward half-hug before we both sat down. "You look good," he said, though his eyes noted the dark circles under mine. "Portland agrees with you. Usually," I agreed, reaching for the coffee the waitress had just set down, "though the job situation has complicated things." He nodded, a flash of genuine sympathy crossing his face. "Dad mentioned the layoff. That's rough." "It's been an adjustment," I acknowledged, but I was already thinking about a change. The agency was getting too corporate, less creative. "Always the artist," he said, and I braced for the usual dismissive tone, but it didn't come. Instead, his voice held something almost like admiration. "So, Lakeside Pines, Dad says you've basically dismantled his entire investment strategy and rebuilt it from scratch in under 48 hours. I laughed despite myself. "That's a bit dramatic. I just saw some angles he hadn't considered." "Don't minimize it," Michael surprised me by saying. "Dad doesn't revise his plans for anyone, especially not in business. The fact that he's even considering your proposals means they must be solid." The waitress returned for our orders. Denver omelet for him, blueberry pancakes for me, our standard choices since high school. Some patterns really didn't change. "Dad also said you found out about Grandpa's provisions for the lake house," Michael continued once she'd left, "that there might be grounds to challenge the sale." "Potentially," I confirmed. "Eleanor Bennett is looking into it. Grandpa was pretty specific about wanting it to stay in the family for at least 2 generations." Michael frowned, poking at the ice in his water glass. "I didn't know that. Did you?" "Not the legal details, no. But he talked about it all the time, Michael. About how the lake house would be there for all of us, for our kids someday." "I guess I wasn't paying attention," he admitted. "The lake house was always more your thing than mine. You were the one who wanted to spend every summer there, because you were always at sports camps or business seminars with Dad," I pointed out. "By the time you were 15, you'd already mapped out your entire path to joining Mitchell Commercial." An uncomfortable silence fell between us as the shadow of our divergent choices hovered in the air. While Michael had followed in our father's footsteps, I had carved my own path, a choice that had created distance not just from our parents, but between us as well. "I always envied that about you," Michael said suddenly, startling me. "How sure you were about not wanting what Dad wanted. For you, how you just left." "It wasn't that simple," I said. "There were a lot of arguments, a lot of disappointment. You were there for some of it." "Yeah, but you still did it. You still walked away." He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture so like our father it was unsettling. "Sometimes I wonder if I ever really had a choice." This was new territory for us. Michael had always seemed content with his place in the family business, proud to be the son who stayed, who carried on the Mitchell legacy. "What changed?" I asked carefully. He was quiet for a moment. "Lakeside Pines, I guess. I've been against it from the beginning, thought it was too leveraged, too risky. I tried to tell Dad, but Dad doesn't listen," I finished for him. "Not to me, anyway." Michael's smile was tinged with bitterness, which is ironic, considering I'm the one who actually got the business degree he wanted. Our food arrived, temporarily pausing the conversation. I watched Michael methodically cut his omelet into perfect bite-sized pieces, a habit he'd had since childhood. Some things really never changed. "So this plan you've come up with," he said after a few bites. "Converting Lakeside Pines into a conservation project, bringing in the Thorntons as investors. Can it actually work?" "It has potential," I said. "Mom's contact at the Conservation Trust seems genuinely interested. If the Thorntons come on board as bridge investors, we might be able to restructure the entire project before the current lender pulls out." "And the lake house? How does that factor in?" I outlined the strategy we developed. using the legal challenge as a way to open negotiations with the Thorntons, potentially offering them a role in the conservation project as part of a broader settlement. "It's clever," Michael acknowledged when I finished. "Risky, but clever. Dad must be impressed." "I think he's more desperate than impressed," I said. "But he's willing to try something new, which is progress." "True." Michael pushed his plate aside, leaning forward. "But here's what I don't understand, Alex. Why are you doing this? After the way Dad's treated you over the years? After them selling the lake house without even telling you? You could have just walked away. Let them deal with the mess they've made." It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly over the past few days. "Partly for Mom," I said honestly. "She doesn't deserve to lose everything because Dad got reckless. Partly for Grandpa's legacy, and partly—" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Partly because I'm tired of being the outsider in this family, of having my opinions dismissed, my choices questioned. Maybe proving I can solve a problem Dad couldn't is petty, but it feels good." Michael laughed, a genuine laugh I hadn't heard from him in years. "That might be the most honest thing you've ever said to me." "What about you?" I countered. "You could let Dad crash and burn, take over the company afterward, clean slate, your vision." His expression sobered. "I thought about it," he admitted. "For about 5 seconds, but it wouldn't be clean. The damage to the company's reputation, to our client relationships, it would take years to recover, if we ever could." Our eyes met across the table, a moment of genuine understanding passing between us. We might have taken different paths, made different choices, but in this, at least, we were aligned. Neither of us wanted to see our family legacy destroyed, even if parts of that legacy had caused us pain. "So we're doing this," I said. "Together." "Together," he agreed, raising his coffee cup in a mock toast. The Mitchell siblings, saving their parents from financial ruin. Who would have thought? After breakfast, Michael headed to the office, promising to start reviewing the legal structures for a potential conservation pivot. I made my way to Eleanor Bennett's office for our scheduled meeting, my mind already racing ahead to the next steps in our plan. Eleanor had more good news. She'd found not just the provision in my grandfather's will regarding the lake house, but also a separate letter he'd written to the family lawyer, specifically stating his wishes that the property remain in Mitchell family hands. The letter wasn't legally binding on its own, but combined with the will provision, it strengthened our potential challenge considerably. "This gives us real leverage," she explained, showing me the highlighted sections of the documents. "Not enough to guarantee we'd win in court, but enough to make a reasonable person think twice about fighting it." "Are the Thorntons reasonable people?" I asked. "From what I can gather, yes. James Thornton has a reputation as a pragmatic businessman, not a legal brawler. And given Green Tech's public environmental commitments, an extended court battle over a lake house potentially protected by legacy provisions wouldn't be good optics for them. So we have a viable opening," I said, relief washing through me. At least this part of our strategy seemed to be falling into place. "Yes, though how you use it matters," Eleanor cautioned. "A direct legal threat could backfire. The approach needs to be more nuanced." "That's where my mother comes in," I explained. "She's reaching out to Catherine Thornton today, woman to woman, previous owner to new owner. The legal angle will only come up once we've established some rapport." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Smart. And this tie-in with the conservation project. For Lakeside Pines?" I outlined our full strategy in more detail than I had yesterday. As I spoke, I could see Eleanor's expression shifting from professional interest to genuine engagement. "It's ambitious," she said when I finished. "Lot of moving parts, lot of people who need to make specific decisions for it to work. But it's also elegant in its way, addressing multiple problems with a single integrated solution." "Do you think it can work?" I asked, valuing her perspective as someone slightly removed from the emotional intensity of the situation. "I think it has a chance," she said carefully. Better than most of the alternatives, certainly. Your family is in a precarious position. Alexandra, this approach at least offers a path forward that could preserve some of what matters most. As I left Eleanor's office, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. Meeting Catherine Thornton for lunch at Oleander Cafe at One Wish. Me luck. I sent back a quick message of encouragement, then headed to a nearby park to collect my thoughts. The morning sun filtered through the trees, warming the bench where I sat, watching children play on a colorful climbing structure. Their laughter and shouts created a soothing background to my racing thoughts. So much was riding on my mother's lunch meeting. If Catherine Thornton was receptive, if she saw the potential for a mutually beneficial resolution, we might have a real chance at salvaging this situation. If not, I pushed the thought away, unwilling to dwell on worst-case scenarios just yet. My phone rang. Jordan Williams. I answered immediately. Alexandra, he said, his voice tense. I've been reviewing the Lakeside Pines situation as you suggested. You were right. It's worse than I realized. How much worse? I asked, my stomach tightening. The primary lender has moved up their timeline. They're not just threatening to pull out anymore. They've initiated the process. Your father probably has less than 2 weeks before they call the loan. 2 weeks, not the month we'd estimated. The timeline for our entire strategy would need to be compressed. Thank you for telling me, I said. Are you willing to help us now? There was a pause. Yes, he said finally. I should have pushed harder against these investments from the beginning. I allowed your father's confidence to override my professional judgment. What matters now is fixing it, I said. Can you prepare an analysis of the conservation pivot? Something showing how it could stabilize the situation, reduce risk? My father respects numbers more than concepts. I've already started, he confirmed. But Alexandra, even with a pivot, the financial hole is deep. Your parents will need to accept significant losses. They know, I assured him. We're past the denial stage. Now we're just trying to ensure those losses don't become catastrophic. After hanging up, I texted my father and brother with the updated timeline from the lender. We would need to move faster, push harder on all fronts. The margin for error, already slim, had just become razor thin. With a few hours to kill before I could expect to hear from my mother about her lunch with Catherine Thornton, I decided to visit the Lakeside Pines property myself. I needed to see firsthand what we were dealing with, what potential the land might hold for a conservation-focused project. The drive took me north of the city, through increasingly rural landscapes until I reached a stretch of road bordered by dense forest on one side and glimpses of a lake on the other. A large sign marked the entrance to the property. Future home of Lakeside Pines, luxury living in harmony with nature. The irony of the tagline wasn't lost on me, given the environmental issues threatening the project. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, but the gate was open, a construction trailer visible inside. I parked and approached cautiously, not sure how I'd explain my presence if challenged. But the trailer appeared empty, the site quiet, except for the rustle of leaves and occasional bird calls. The property was beautiful, I had to admit. Rolling hills leading down to a shimmering lake, old-growth forest creating natural boundaries, wildflowers dotting meadows in bursts of color. I could see why my father had been attracted to it as a development opportunity. I could also see why environmental groups were fighting to protect it. Walking the perimeter, I began to envision what it could become with a conservation focus. Boardwalks through protected wetlands, a nature center for education, clusters of sustainable homes set back from the most sensitive areas. It would be a radical departure from the luxury retirement community my father had planned, but possibly something more valuable in the long run. I took photos on my phone, making mental notes about potential features, areas that would need special protection. By the time I returned to my car, I had the beginnings of a vision that felt both practical and inspiring, something that might appeal to the Conservation Trust and, hopefully, to the Thorntons. My phone rang as I was driving back to the city. My mother's name flashed on the screen, and I pulled over quickly to answer. "Mom, how did it go with Catherine Thornton?" "Better than I dared hope," she said, her voice animated in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Alexandra, she's wonderful, smart, thoughtful, and genuinely interested in the history of the lake house. Did you bring up Grandpa's wishes?" "Yes, though carefully. I framed it as family history I wanted to share, stories and memories that go with the property." She was fascinated, especially when I mentioned some of the conservation work your grandfather did on the land. Conservation work? This was news to me. "Oh yes," my mother said. "Your grandfather was quite ahead of his time. He worked with the county to establish protected zones for certain bird species that nested near the lake. Catherine was particularly interested in that. Turns out she's on the board of a bird sanctuary." Another potential connection, another thread in the web we were trying to weave. "Did you mention James at all? Or their potential interest in other projects?" "Not directly," my mother said, "but Catherine brought him up herself. Apparently, they've been looking for opportunities to expand Green Tech's conservation portfolio. They want projects that demonstrate how technology and environmental protection can work together." "That's perfect," I said, excitement building. "Did you suggest a meeting with all of us?" "Better." My mother sounded pleased with herself. "They've invited us to dinner at their home tomorrow night. Both of them, all four of us. She said James is particularly interested in meeting you. Apparently, he read about that sustainability campaign you developed for Oregon breweries last year." I blinked in surprise. My work had caught the attention of the CEO of Green Tech. That was unexpected, but potentially very useful. "That's great, Mom. Really great." "I thought so too," she said. "Oh, and Alexandra, she mentioned that while they love the lake house property, they've been a bit overwhelmed by its size. They really just wanted the lakefront portion for weekend getaways, not the entire acreage." Another promising sign. If the Thorntons were already finding the property more than they needed, they might be more open to a creative resolution that let them keep part while returning the rest to our family. "This is all good news," I said. "Have you told Dad yet?" "I'm heading home now to brief him," she replied. "I'll call you afterward with the plan for tomorrow's dinner." After hanging up, I sat in my car for a moment, processing this development. Things were moving faster than expected, connections forming almost organically. Was it possible that this crisis might actually lead to something positive? Not just a mitigation of disaster, but new relationships, new opportunities that wouldn't have existed otherwise? I drove back to my hotel feeling cautiously optimistic. There were still many hurdles ahead, many points where our plan could falter. But for the first time, I could see a path forward that felt not just possible, but promising. Back in my room, I spread out the photos I'd taken at the Lakeside Pines property and began sketching rough concepts for a conservation-focused development. My marketing background gave me a framework for how to position such a project, how to highlight its unique value proposition for potential partners and investors. As evening approached, my phone rang again, my father this time. "Alexandra, your mother told me about the dinner invitation tomorrow. This is moving quickly." "Too quickly?" I asked, sensing tension in his voice. "No, it's good timing given the lender situation." He paused. "Jordan called me today. Told me he's been speaking with you." I tensed, unsure how my father would react to my having engaged his financial advisor directly. I thought he might have a useful perspective. To my surprise, he didn't object. He did. His analysis of the conservation pivot is compelling. More conservative returns, but significantly reduced risk, especially with the right partners. "And the Conservation Trust Mom contacted seems interested," I added. If the Thorntons come on board as bridge investors, we could have a viable restructuring plan within the 2-week window. Possible, he agreed, though I could hear the strain in his voice. The Robert Mitchell I knew hated depending on others, hated not being in complete control of his business dealings. This situation was forcing him to operate in ways that went against decades of habit. "Dad," I said carefully, "for this dinner tomorrow to be successful, we all need to be aligned. The Thorntons need to see a united family with a clear vision, not 4 people with different agendas." "I'm aware," he said, a hint of his old sharpness returning. Then, surprising me, he added, "I was hoping you would take the lead on presenting the conservation concept. You have the marketing background, and frankly, you seem to have the clearest vision for what it could become." It was perhaps the closest thing to a professional compliment my father had ever given me. "I can do that," I said, keeping my tone even despite the flush of validation I felt. "But they need to hear from you too, Dad. Your experience, your track record in development. That lends credibility to the whole proposition." "Agreed," he said. "Your mother has suggested we host a planning session tonight at the house. 7 o'clock. Can you make it?" "I'll be there," I promised. After hanging up, I gathered my notes and sketches, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Family dynamics were shifting rapidly, roles and relationships reconfiguring in ways I hadn't anticipated. My father asking me to take the lead on a business presentation? My mother emerging as a skilled relationship builder with her own professional connections? My brother acknowledging doubts about the path he'd chosen? It was as if the crisis had cracked open a fossilized family structure, allowing new growth to emerge from the fissures. Whether these changes would last beyond the immediate situation remained to be seen, but for now, they offered pathways for collaboration that hadn't existed before. The family home was buzzing with activity when I arrived that evening. Michael was already there, laptop open on the dining room table, surrounded by financial projections and legal documents. My father was on the phone in his study, his voice carrying through the partially open door as he negotiated with someone about timeline extensions. My mother was in the kitchen, arranging a platter of sandwiches and fruit, while simultaneously taking notes from a conversation with someone from the Conservation Trust. It felt like campaign headquarters before an election. Everyone focused, on their tasks but working toward a common goal. This coordinated effort from the Mitchell family was unprecedented in my experience, and I found myself wondering what might have been possible if we'd learned to work together like this years. "Ego. Alex, good, you're here," Michael called when he spotted me. "I've been reviewing the zoning regulations for conservation developments. There are some interesting tax incentives if we structure this properly." I joined him at the table, setting down my bag of sketches and notes. That would certainly help offset some of the losses from changing direction. My mother brought the food platter over, looking more energized than I'd seen her in years. "Elizabeth from the Trust is sending over their preliminary assessment of the property's conservation value. Apparently, there's a rare wetland ecosystem on the northeast corner that could qualify for special protection status, which could attract grant funding," I added, seeing how the pieces might fit together. My father emerged from his study, ending his call with a terse, "Keep me updated." He looked tired but focused as he joined us at the table. The bank has agreed to delay formally calling the loan until after the weekend, but that's the best I could get. We have until Monday to present them with a viable restructuring plan. "So tomorrow's dinner with the Thorntons is crucial," I said. "Precisely." My father picked up a sandwich, though I suspected he was too tense to have much appetite. "We need to come away with at least a preliminary commitment from them to consider the investment opportunity. And we need to handle the lake house situation delicately," my mother added. "Balance asserting our family's historical connection without appearing threatening." "Eleanor has prepared a brief outlining Grandpa's provisions," I said, pulling it from my bag. "Not as a legal threat, but as background information they should be aware of. She suggests presenting it as our desire to find a mutually beneficial resolution, rather than pursuing legal remedies. My father reviewed the document, nodding slowly. This is well done. Firm, but not aggressive. I've also prepared some concepts for what Lakeside Pines could become as a conservation-focused development, I said, spreading out my sketches on the table. These are rough, obviously, but they give a sense of the vision. Everyone gathered around to look. I'd drawn several views of how the property might be transformed. Nature trails winding through protected wetlands, a research center for environmental education, clusters of eco-friendly homes set harmoniously into the landscape. I'd even sketched how GreenTech's sustainable technologies could be showcased throughout the project, creating a living demonstration of their environmental commitment. "This is impressive, Alex," Michael said, studying the sketches. "You've managed to preserve a lot of the residential component while prioritizing the conservation aspects." "The revenue potential is lower," I acknowledged, "but so are the development costs and regulatory hurdles. And the marketing value is significant. This would be one of the first developments of its kind in the region." My father was quiet as he examined the drawings, his expression unreadable. Then, looking up at me, he said something I never thought I'd hear from him. "This is better than my original concept. More sustainable, more forward-thinking, less profit per unit, but lower risk and longer-term value." The compliment landed like a physical weight, momentarily stunning me into silence. My mother smiled, reaching over to squeeze my hand, while Michael raised an eyebrow in a look that said, "Did that actually just happen?" "Thank you," I managed finally. "I think it plays to all our strengths as a family. Dad's development expertise, Mom's community connections, Michael's financial and legal knowledge, my marketing background. A true Mitchell family enterprise," my mother said softly. "Your grandfather would have loved that." The mention of my grandfather brought us back to the lake house issue, the emotional core of all that had transpired. "So how do we approach this with the Thorntons?" Michael asked. "We need their investment in Lakeside Pines to save the project, but we also want to challenge their ownership of the lake house. That's a difficult needle to thread." "I think we need to separate the issues in our presentation, but connect them. In the resolution," I suggested. "First, we introduce the conservation project as an investment opportunity that aligns with their values and corporate mission. Then, separately, we share the information about Grandpa's provisions for the lake house. Only after both issues are on the table do we suggest a comprehensive solution." "Which would be?" my father prompted. "The Thorntons invest in the Lakeside Pines Conservation Project, taking over the position of the current lender. In exchange, we reach a compromise on the lake house. Perhaps they keep the portion of the property they're most interested in, while returning the main cabin and surrounding acreage to our family." "And if they're not interested in the investment?" Michael pressed. "If they only want to discuss the lake house?" "Then we pivot," I said simply. "We focus on finding a resolution for the lake house that honors both their purchase and Grandpa's wishes. The conservation project would need to find another path forward." My father nodded slowly. "Flexibility will be key. We need to be prepared to adapt based on their reactions, their interests." "Exactly," I agreed. "Which is why all four of us need to be completely aligned on our priorities, our boundaries, and our fallback positions." For the next several hours, we worked through scenarios, planned our presentation, assigned roles for the dinner meeting. My father would handle the financial aspects, my mother the relationship building, Michael the legal framework, and I would present the conservation vision. We practiced how we would introduce the lake house issue, how we would respond to potential objections or concerns, how we would articulate the benefits of a partnership. It was past midnight when we finally finished, all of us exhausted but more prepared than we had been. As I gathered my things to leave, my father approached me, his expression serious. "Alexandra," he said, using my full name as he always did, "in important moments, I want you to know that regardless of how this turns out, I've been impressed by how you've handled this situation. Your strategic thinking, your creativity, your commitment to finding a solution that works for the whole. Family. Coming from Robert Mitchell, this was the equivalent of effusive praise. I swallowed against a sudden tightness in my throat. "Thank you, Dad," I said simply. "That means a lot." "I've been thinking," he continued, clearly uncomfortable but pressing, about what happens after we resolve this crisis, about your role in the company moving forward." I stiffened slightly. Was this heading where I thought it was? "Dad, I'm not sure." He held up a hand. "Not in the way I've pushed for before, not in operations or development, but perhaps a new division, something focused on sustainable marketing, environmentally conscious branding, an area where your specific expertise would be valuable." The offer hung in the air between us, not a demand or expectation as his previous attempts had been, but an invitation, a recognition of my skills and an acknowledgement that there might be a place for me in the family business after all, on my own terms. "I'll think about it," I promised, neither accepting nor rejecting the idea outright. "Let's get through this first." He nodded, seemingly satisfied with that response. One crisis at a time. As I drove back to my hotel, the city lights blurring through a light rain that had begun to fall, I felt a strange sense of possibility opening up before me. Whatever happened with the Thorntons tomorrow, whatever the ultimate fate of Lakeside, Pines and the lake house, something had shifted within my family. Old wounds were being acknowledged, old patterns disrupted, new connections formed. I wasn't naive enough to think that all our issues could be resolved through one crisis. No matter how transformative. Years of miscommunication and hurt couldn't be erased in a few days of collaborative problem-solving. But perhaps they could be the foundation for something new, something healthier for all of us. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own opportunities. The dinner with the Thorntons represented both our greatest hope for resolving the immediate financial crisis and a chance to reclaim a piece of my grandfather's legacy that I had thought was lost forever. For tonight, though, I would rest, gathering my strength for what promised to be one of the most consequential encounters of my life. Not just for me, but for my entire family's future. The Thornton residence was everything I expected from the CEO of Green Tech Solutions. A modernist structure of glass, sustainable timber, and living walls that seemed to grow organically from the hillside overlooking Puget Sound. Solar panels gleamed on the roof, while a small wind turbine turned lazily at the property's edge. It was a physical manifestation of the company's ethos, innovation in harmony with nature. "Impressive," my father murmured as we pulled into the circular driveway, our family arriving in a single car, another small symbol of our newfound unity. My mother smoothed her dress as we approached the entrance, her nerves showing only in the slight tremble of her hands. "Remember, we're here as guests first. The business discussion comes only after we've established rapport." The door opened before we could ring the bell, revealing Catherine Thornton, a tall woman with silver-streaked dark hair and an easy smile. "Linda, how wonderful to see you again," she greeted my mother warmly. "And this must be your family. Please come in." James Thornton joined us in the expansive living room, his tech mogul status belied by his casual manner and genuine handshake. "The Mitchell family. I've been looking forward to meeting all of you." After introductions, we were led through the house to a terrace overlooking the water, where a table had been set for dinner. The conversation flowed surprisingly easily, Catherine asking about my marketing work in Portland, James discussing sustainable business practices with my father, my mother and Michael engaging on local Seattle topics. It wasn't until we were finishing the main course that James shifted the conversation toward business. "Linda mentioned you've been developing a property north of here," he said to my father. "Lakeside Pines, I believe?" My father nodded, setting down his fork with measured precision. "Yes, though the project is currently in a state of evolution." "Evolution?" James raised an eyebrow, his interest clearly piqued. "We're reconsidering the direction," my father explained carefully. "The original concept was a luxury retirement community, but we've identified some compelling reasons to pivot toward a conservation-focused development instead." Catherine leaned forward slightly. "That sounds fascinating. What prompted the change?" My parents exchanged a glance, and my mother gave a small nod. It was time to begin revealing our situation, carefully but honestly. "Several factors," my father said. "Environmental considerations, community feedback, and some financial reassessments." "What Robert means," my mother interjected gently, "is that we've realized the property has greater potential, both environmentally and ultimately, economically, as a conservation showcase rather than a traditional development." James studied my father for a moment. Changing direction mid-project is always challenging, especially with investors and lenders already committed to a specific vision. The statement was casual but pointed. James Thornton had clearly done his homework on Lakeside Pines. "It is challenging," my father acknowledged, "but sometimes the right path forward requires courage to change course." "Alexandra has actually developed some remarkable concepts for what the property could become," my mother added, giving me my cue. I pulled out the portfolio I'd prepared, expanding on the sketches I'd shown my family the night before. "The property has unique environmental assets that could be preserved and showcased rather than built over," I explained, spreading the drawings across the cleared dinner table. "Specifically, there's a rare wetland ecosystem that the Conservation Trust has, identified as having significant ecological value." The Thorntons leaned in to examine the concepts, their interest visible. I outlined the vision for nature trails, the research center, the clusters of eco-friendly homes set back from sensitive areas. "Most importantly," I continued, "the entire development could serve as a living laboratory for sustainable technologies. Smart water management systems, renewable energy integration, building materials that actually benefit the environment rather than just minimizing harm." James looked up sharply at this. "The kind of technologies green tech has been developing." "Exactly," I confirmed. "When we began researching this pivot, your company's work came up repeatedly as the gold standard for what we'd want to incorporate. It wasn't flattery. Green tech really was leading in sustainable building technology. But the connection wasn't lost on James, whose expression shifted from polite interest to genuine engagement. "You've put considerable thought into this," he said, examining the sketches more closely. "The integration of conservation and development is something we've been exploring conceptually, but there aren't many real-world examples at this scale." "Which is precisely why it's so exciting," Catherine added, turning to my mother. "I was telling Linda yesterday about our interest in finding projects that align with our values. This seems serendipitous." The word hung in the air, creating an opening for the next phase of our strategy. My father cleared his throat slightly. "Speaking of serendipity," he said carefully, "there's another matter we wanted to discuss with you both this evening. Something that also represents an unexpected connection between our families." The Thorntons exchanged a glance. "The lake house," Catherine said simply. My mother nodded. "Yes. When we met yesterday, I mentioned some of my father-in-law's history with the property. There's more to that story that we think you should be aware of." I watched the Thorntons' expressions closely as my father explained about my grandfather's provisions, his documented wishes that the lake house remain in the family for at least 2 generations. He was careful to present it as information they should have, rather than a direct challenge to their purchase. "We've only recently discovered the full extent of these provisions ourselves," my father concluded. "Our family lawyer, Eleanor Bennett, has prepared a brief overview if you'd like to review it." James accepted the document, scanning it thoughtfully. "This is unexpected," he said finally. "When we purchased the property, the title search didn't reveal any such conditions." "They wouldn't necessarily appear in a standard title search," Michael explained. The provisions were part of our grandfather's estate planning documents, not recorded with the property deed itself. That's partly why they were overlooked when my parents decided to sell. I see. James set the document down, his expression neutral but thoughtful. So, what exactly are you proposing here? A legal challenge to our purchase? The directness of the question created a moment of tension. This was the critical juncture where our approach could either open a productive negotiation or devolve into adversarial positions. What we're hoping for, I said carefully, is a conversation about how we might honor my grandfather's wishes while also respecting your purchase and your plans for the property. Catherine mentioned yesterday that you were primarily interested in the lakefront portion, my mother added, that you found the full acreage somewhat more than you needed. Catherine nodded slowly. That's true. The lakefront and about an acre surrounding it is what drew us to the property. The cabin itself, while charming, is larger than we need for a weekend retreat, and the additional 10 acres of woodlands require more maintenance than we'd anticipated. So perhaps, my father suggested, there's a possibility of a partial return of the property, the cabin and woods to our family, while you retain the lakefront parcel you're most interested in. James studied us carefully, his business acumen evident in his measured response. An interesting proposition, though I imagine there would be financial considerations to such an arrangement. Of course, my father agreed. We would expect to compensate you fairly for the value of any portion of the property you return to us. With what resources? James asked bluntly. Forgive my directness, but if Lakeside Pines is facing the kind of challenges that necessitate a complete pivot in strategy, I assume your financial situation is constrained. And there it was, the question we'd been anticipating, the one that would allow us to connect the two issues we'd presented. I glanced at my father, who gave me a slight nod to continue. You're right, I acknowledged. The Lakeside Pines situation has created financial challenges for our family. The current lender is preparing to call their loan, which would likely force a distressed sale of the property, a lose-lose situation for everyone involved, including the environment. What we're proposing, Michael continued seamlessly, is a comprehensive arrangement that addresses both situations. GreenTech would step in as the primary investor in the conservation-focused version of Lakeside Pines, taking over the position currently held by First Northwest Bank. In exchange, my father added, we would restructure the lake house purchase, with you retaining the lakefront parcel you desire while returning the cabin and woodlands to our family. The value difference would be factored into the overall investment structure of Lakeside Pines. The Thorntons were silent for a moment, processing the interconnected proposal we'd presented. Then James leaned back in his chair, an expression of grudging respect crossing his face. That's quite a package you've put together, he said. Elegant in its way, addressing multiple problems with a single solution. He turned to Catherine. What do you think, dear? Catherine considered for a moment. The lake house situation is unexpected, but not entirely surprising given the property's history. As for Lakeside Pines, she gestured toward my sketches. The conservation concept is genuinely compelling. It's the kind of showcase project we've been discussing for GreenTech's environmental initiatives. James nodded, then turned back to us. Before we discuss this further, I need to understand the financial situation with Lakeside Pines more clearly. What exactly are the lender's concerns? What's the timeline we're working with? My father hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with revealing the full extent of our vulnerability. This was the moment where pride could derail everything, where his natural instinct to project strength and control could undermine the honesty needed to move forward. To my surprise, he took a deep breath and opted for complete transparency. The lender has lost confidence in the project as originally conceived. Environmental challenges, regulatory hurdles, and community opposition have created delays that threaten the financial viability of the luxury development model. They've initiated the process to call their loan, which would trigger a cascade of problems. We have until Monday to present them with a restructuring plan, or they'll formally demand repayment. Which you cannot provide, James stated rather than asked. Not without liquidating additional assets at distressed prices, my father confirmed. The situation is urgent but not yet desperate. If we can secure a replacement lender or investor quickly. James and Catherine exchanged another look, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then James stood up. "I'd like to show you something," he said, gesturing for us to follow him inside. We were led to a home office where a large digital display dominated one wall. James activated it with a gesture, bringing up a map of the region north of Seattle. "This is GreenTech's strategic development map," he explained. "The green markers represent areas we've identified as having both ecological significance and potential for sustainable development showcase projects." A cluster of green markers was visible precisely in the area where Lakeside Pines was located. "We've been looking for a flagship project in this region for over a year," he continued. "Something substantial enough to demonstrate the full range of our environmental technologies in a real-world setting." Catherine picked up the thread. "When Linda told me about your family's connection to the lake house, I did some research on your other properties and discovered Lakeside Pines. The location immediately caught my attention because of this mapping project." "So you were already aware of Lakeside Pines before tonight," Michael observed. "Aware of it, yes," James confirmed, "though not of its financial situation or your pivot plans. We had actually considered approaching whoever developed that land eventually to propose incorporating our technologies, but a partnership from the ground up would be far more effective. As for the lake house," Catherine added, "James and I have already been discussing how much of the property we actually need. We love the lakefront, but the cabin itself isn't quite our style, and the acreage is more than we want to maintain. The synchronicity was almost too perfect, making me momentarily suspicious. Had they known more than they were letting on? Had this entire evening been orchestrated to appear as a fortuitous alignment when in fact they'd been planning to approach us anyway? But then I caught something in Catherine's expression, a genuine warmth when she looked at my mother, a sincerity that was hard to fake. Perhaps this really was one of those rare moments when mutual interests aligned in ways no one could have predicted. "So where does this leave us?" my father asked, his businessman's caution reasserting itself. James turned off the display and faced us directly. "With the potential for a mutually beneficial arrangement, I think. Catherine and I need to review the financial details of Lakeside Pines, of course, and we'd want our own environmental team to assess the property's conservation value." "That seems reasonable," my father agreed. "Though, as I mentioned, our timeline is constrained." "We understand," Catherine assured him. "What if we scheduled those assessments for tomorrow? Our team could visit the property in the morning, and by afternoon we could have a preliminary discussion about financial terms." My father looked surprised at the rapid timeline. "You could move that quickly?" "When an opportunity aligns with our strategic priorities, yes," James said simply. "One of the advantages of running your own company is being able to make decisions without layers of bureaucracy." My mother, who had been quietly observing the exchange, spoke up. "And the lake house? What are your thoughts on that situation?" Catherine's expression softened. "I've been thinking about what you shared, Linda. About your family's history with the property, your father-in-law's wishes. The cabin clearly means a great deal to all of you, especially to Alexandra." She glanced at me with unexpected perception. "It does," I admitted. "It's where many of my fondest childhood memories were formed, where part of my grandfather's ashes are scattered." Catherine nodded. "James and I have discussed it, and we're open to the idea of restructuring the purchase. We would keep the lakefront parcel, perhaps 2 acres in total, and return the cabin and remaining acreage to your family. Subject to appropriate financial adjustments," James added, ever the businessman. which could potentially be integrated into the Lakeside Pines investment structure, as you suggested. The relief that washed through me was almost physical, a weightlifting that I hadn't fully acknowledged until that moment. The lake house, or at least the part that mattered most to me, might actually come back to our family. My father extended his hand to James. "This sounds like a promising foundation. Shall we schedule a meeting tomorrow afternoon to discuss specific terms?" 3:00, at my office downtown, James agreed, shaking my father's hand. "Bring your financial team and we'll have ours present as well." As we prepared to leave, Catherine pulled me aside while the others were gathering their things. "Your mother told me how much the cabin means to you," she said quietly. "About your special connection to your grandfather, about scattering his ashes in the garden." I nodded, surprised by the personal turn. "It's more than just a vacation property to me." "I understand that now," she said. "When we bought it, we saw only a beautiful piece of real estate. We didn't see the memories, the connections, the history. I'm glad we have the opportunity to find a solution that honors that history." Her sincerity was touching, an unexpected moment of human connection in what had begun as a strategic negotiation. "Thank you for being open to it," I said. "Most people in your position would have simply dismissed our concerns or fought us in court." "Life's too short for unnecessary conflicts," she said with a small smile. "Besides, I have a feeling this is the beginning of a much more interesting partnership than just a real estate transaction." As we drove away from the Thornton residence, a tentative optimism filled the car. None of us wanted to jinx the progress by being too confident, but it was clear that the evening had gone better than any of us had dared hope. "They were already interested in Lakeside Pines," Michael said, breaking the thoughtful silence. "That map James showed us. They had identified the area long before tonight." "Does that matter?" my mother asked. "Their interest seems genuine, regardless of when it began." "It doesn't matter," my father said firmly. "Business is about finding aligned interests. The fact that they were already looking in that direction only increases the likelihood of a successful partnership." "And the lake house?" I asked, the question that mattered most to me personally. "They seem sincere about being willing to restructure that purchase," my father said. Catherine clearly connected with the family history aspect. "Your mother laid excellent groundwork there," he added, reaching over to squeeze my mother's hand in a rare public display of affection. "That lunch yesterday was more valuable than I realized." My mother smiled, a mixture of pride and relief visible in her expression. I had a feeling Catherine would understand. She mentioned losing her own family home in Connecticut when her parents died. She regrets not finding a way to keep it in the family. Another connection, another thread binding this unexpected alliance together. Perhaps my grandfather's hand was in this somehow, guiding us toward a resolution that would honor his wishes while creating something new and valuable. Back at my hotel, I found myself too wired to sleep despite the late hour. The adrenaline of the evening's success, the cautious hope for tomorrow's negotiations, the emotional prospect of reclaiming the lake house cabin, it all combined to keep my mind racing. I opened my laptop and began refining the conservation development concepts, adding details about how GreenTech's specific technologies could be integrated. If tomorrow's meeting was going to solidify this partnership, having concrete visualizations would help everyone see the shared vision more clearly. Around 2 a.m, my phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Still up?" "Yes," I replied, "working on the presentation for tomorrow." "Me too. Dad's got me running financial scenarios. Want to compare notes?" I suggested a video call, and moments later, Michael's face appeared on my screen, looking as tired but wired. As I felt. "Tonight went well," he said without preamble. "Almost suspiciously well." "I had the same thought," I admitted. "But I think it's just one of those rare situations where everyone's interests genuinely align." "Maybe," he conceded. I've been digging deeper into GreenTech's financials. They have the capacity to take on the Lakeside Pines investment easily. Their sustainable building division has been looking for showcase projects, and their last quarterly report specifically mentioned seeking conservation development opportunities. So we're not just convenient marks, I said with a slight smile. They actually want what we're offering. Appears that way, he agreed. I've run preliminary numbers on the lake house split they suggested. If they keep 2 acres with the lakefront, and we get the cabin and remaining 9 acres, the value differential is approximately $400,000 in their favor, which could be factored into the Lakeside Pines investment. I finished the thought. Dad would be contributing additional equity through the lake house transaction. Exactly. It's all coming together surprisingly neatly. I studied my brother's face on the screen, noting the shadows under his eyes, but also a spark I hadn't seen in years. You're enjoying this, aren't you? The problem solving, the negotiations, the creative restructuring? He smiled ruefully. Is it that obvious? This is the first time in years I've felt like I'm actually using my brain at work, not just following Dad's playbook. It suits you, I told him honestly. You're good at finding the connections, seeing the financial angles. And you're good at the vision part, he countered. Those conservation concepts? They're inspired, Alex. Even James Thornton was impressed, and he's seen it all. The compliment warmed me. We make a good team, don't we? When we're not being pushed into roles we didn't choose. Yeah, he agreed quietly. Maybe that's the silver lining in all this. Maybe we needed a crisis to break us out of the patterns we were stuck in. It was a moment of genuine connection between us, a bridge across the years of distance that had grown while he followed our father's path and I carved my own. Get some sleep, I advised. Tomorrow's going to be intense. You too, he said. Big day for the Mitchell family. After we hung up, I worked for another hour on the presentations, then finally collapsed into bed as dawn was breaking. Despite the minimal sleep, I woke feeling energized, focused on the tasks ahead. The morning brought a flurry of activity. The Thorntons' environmental team was already at the Lakeside Pines property by 9, conducting their assessment. Jordan. Williams had prepared detailed financial projections for the conservation pivot, identifying precisely how GreenTech's investment could replace the current lender's position while providing additional capital for the redesign. My father and Michael were meeting with our company's legal team, preparing the framework for a potential partnership agreement. My mother was coordinating with Eleanor Bennett on the lake house aspect, ensuring that any restructuring of that purchase would properly honor my grandfather's provisions while being fair to the Thorntons. I spent the morning finalizing the presentation materials, creating visual representations of what Lakeside Pines could become and how the lake house property might be divided. By noon, I had a comprehensive package ready for the afternoon meeting. We all gathered for a quick lunch and strategy session before heading to GreenTech headquarters. The mood was focused, professional, a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil of just days earlier. Initial feedback from the Thorntons' environmental team is positive, my father reported. They're particularly interested in the wetland ecosystem we identified. And Jordan's financial projections show that with GreenTech as the primary investor, we could not only satisfy the current lender, but also have sufficient capital to properly launch the conservation redevelopment, Michael added. The Lake House division proposal is ready, I confirmed. Eleanor has reviewed it and believes it satisfies the requirements of Grandpa's provisions while being fair to both parties. My mother squeezed my hand under the table. We're as prepared as we can be, she said. Now we just need to present our case clearly and be open to their perspective as well. As we headed to GreenTech's downtown headquarters, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me. Whatever happened in the next few hours would set the course for our family's future, financially, professionally, and personally. Yet I wasn't afraid. We had faced the crisis together, developed a strategy together, and would now navigate the outcome together. The Green Tech building was, unsurprisingly, an architectural showcase of sustainable design, a tower of smart glass and vertical, gardens that seemed to breathe with the city around it. We were escorted to a conference room on the top floor, where James and Catherine Thornton were waiting along with their executive team. "The Mitchell family," James greeted us, gesturing to the seats prepared for us. "Thank you for coming. I believe we have much to discuss." The negotiation was about to begin, and with it, the final phase of our family's unexpected journey through crisis to potential redemption. The Green Tech conference room buzzed with anticipation as both teams arranged their materials across the sleek, sustainable bamboo table. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Seattle's skyline, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the harbor. It felt surreal to be sitting there, about to negotiate a deal that could salvage my family's financial future while potentially reclaiming the lake house that meant so much to me personally. James Thornton opened the meeting with characteristic directness. "Our environmental assessment team has completed their initial review of the Lakeside Pines property," he announced, nodding to a woman at his right. "Dr. Chen, would you share your findings?" Dr. Chen, a poised environmental scientist with quick, intelligent eyes, pulled up a series of images on the room's main display. "The property contains several ecologically significant features," she began. "Most notably, the Northeastern Wetland Complex supports 3 species currently listed as threatened in Washington state. The old-growth section along the western boundary includes specimens estimated to be over 200 years old." She continued with scientific precision, outlining water quality indicators, wildlife corridors, and habitat diversity across the property. With each point, I watched my father's expression shift from polite interest to genuine engagement. He was seeing the land through new eyes, recognizing value beyond its development potential. "Our conclusion," Dr. Chen finished, "is that this property represents an exceptional opportunity for conservation-focused development. The sensitive areas constitute approximately 60% of the total acreage, while the remaining 40% could support thoughtfully designed residential and educational facilities with minimal environmental impact." James looked to my father. "Your daughter's conservation concept aligns remarkably well with Dr. Chen's assessment. It's almost as if she had insider knowledge of the ecological layout." I felt a flush of pride at the implied compliment. "I spent time walking the property," I explained. "Even to an amateur eye, the areas that felt most special, most worth preserving, were evident." Catherine smiled. "Sometimes intuition catches what science later confirms." The conversation shifted to financials, with Jordan Williams presenting our projections for the conservation pivot. Michael followed with a detailed explanation of how Green Tech's investment could replace the current lender while providing additional capital for the redesign. James's CFO, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya Sharma, questioned several assumptions, pushing for more conservative revenue projections and higher contingency reserves. Michael held his ground on some points while conceding others, the 2 financial experts finding a middle ground through respectful but vigorous debate. Throughout this exchange, I watched my father carefully. The old Robert Mitchell would have intervened, asserted control, potentially derailed the productive back and forth. But this new version sat back, allowing Michael to lead the financial discussion, offering input only when directly addressed. It was a small but significant shift that spoke volumes about how our family dynamics were evolving. After nearly 2 hours of discussing Lakeside Pines, James called for a short break. As servers brought in refreshments, the 2 teams mingled casually, the atmosphere noticeably warmer than when we'd begun. I found myself standing by the window with Catherine, both of us gazing out at the city below. "You've done remarkable work pulling this proposal together in such a short time," she said, "especially given the circumstances that prompted it." "Crisis can be clarifying," I replied. "It forced us to look beyond our usual patterns, to find creative solutions rather, Then just damage control. She nodded thoughtfully. James and I have been impressed not just with the proposal itself, but with how your family has approached this situation. There's a unity of purpose that's quite compelling. That's new for us, I admitted. We haven't always been the most functional family unit. Few families are, she said with a knowing smile. James and I have had our share of disagreements about business, family, priorities. What matters is finding your way back to common ground. As the break ended and we returned to our seats, James redirected the conversation. Let's discuss the lake house, he said, his tone shifting to something more personal. Catherine and I have given this considerable thought since our dinner conversation. My heart rate quickened. This was the piece that mattered most to me, though I'd tried to maintain professional detachment throughout the negotiations. We've reviewed the provisions in your grandfather's estate planning documents, James continued. While we believe our purchase was legally sound, we also recognize the deep family connection to the property. We're prepared to restructure the transaction in a way that honors those connections. Catherine took over, pulling up images of the lake house property on the display. As we discussed last night, James and I are primarily interested in the lakefront portion for our weekend retreat. We'd propose retaining approximately 2 acres, including 200 feet of shoreline and the boat dock. She highlighted the area on the map, then continued. We would return the main cabin and the remaining 9 acres to the Mitchell family, including the gardens where Alexandra's grandfather's ashes were scattered and the wooded trails that hold so many family memories. My throat tightened with unexpected emotion. They had been listening, really listening, when we'd shared what the property meant to us. My mother spoke up. That's a very generous proposal. What terms would you envision for this restructuring? James deferred to Priya, who outlined a straightforward proposition. The value differential between what the Thorntons would keep and what they would return was approximately $400,000. This amount could be converted into additional equity in the Lakeside Pines investment, effectively increasing my father's ownership stake in the conservation project. In essence, Priya explained, Mr. Mitchell would be exchanging partial value of the lake house for increased equity in Lakeside Pines. The transactions would be legally separate but financially linked. My father considered this for a moment. And the timeline. Given the urgency with our current lender, we're prepared to move quickly, James assured him. GreenTech would provide a letter of intent today regarding the Lakeside Pines investment, which should satisfy your lender's immediate concerns. We could close on both transactions, the Lakeside Pines investment and the lake house restructuring, within 10 business days. It was almost too good to be true, a comprehensive solution that addressed both our financial crisis and the emotional wound of losing the lake house, all within a time frame that would avert disaster with the bank. Michael asked several detailed questions about the equity structure, while our family lawyer consulted briefly with Eleanor Bennett via video call about the lake house division. Each point was discussed methodically, potential issues identified, and resolved. The negotiation was proceeding with a smoothness that seemed almost surreal after the chaotic events of the past week. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, the key terms were agreed upon and summarized. GreenTech would invest $5.8 million in the Lakeside Pines conservation development, taking over the current lender's position and providing additional capital for the redesign. My father's ownership stake would increase from 55% to 68%, partially through the lake house value conversion. The lake house property would be divided as Catherine had outlined, with the Thorntons retaining the lakefront parcel while returning the cabin and majority of the land to our family. Both transactions would close simultaneously within 10 business days. James stood, extending his hand to my father. I believe we have a deal, Robert. My father rose to shake his hand. Yes, I believe we do, James. Then, in a moment that surprised, everyone, he added, and thank you, not just for the business arrangement, but for your understanding regarding the lake house. It means more to my family than I had fully appreciated." The admission, both of gratitude and of his own limited perspective, was so uncharacteristic of the Robert Mitchell I had known that I found myself blinking back tears. My mother reached for my hand under the table, squeezing it gently in shared recognition of the significance of his words. As the legal teams began drafting the formal letters of intent, James invited us to continue our conversation over dinner at a nearby restaurant. The meal marked a transition from negotiation to celebration, from potential partners to actual allies in a shared vision. We toasted the conservation project, the lake house resolution, and the beginning of what promised to be a productive relationship between our families. By the time we returned to our hotel that night, exhaustion finally caught up with the adrenaline that had been carrying me through the week, but it was a satisfied exhaustion, the kind that comes from meaningful accomplishment rather than futile struggle. My father paused as we crossed the hotel lobby. "Alexandra, would you join me for a moment?" he asked, gesturing toward the quiet seating area near the fireplace. I followed, curious about what he might want to discuss privately. We sat in 2 armchairs slightly apart from the others, the flickering firelight casting warm shadows across his face. For a moment, he simply looked at me, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in years. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, the words coming with obvious difficulty. Several apologies, actually. I waited, giving him space to continue. "I shouldn't have sold the lake house without consulting you," he acknowledged. "I knew what it meant to you, how connected you felt to your grandfather there. But I convinced myself it was just sentiment, that the practical financial considerations outweighed those emotional attachments." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I was wrong about that. But I've been wrong about many things, particularly regarding you, Alexandra." "Dad," I began, but he held up a hand. "Please, let me finish. I've spent years trying to fit you into the role I imagined for you in the family business, never truly seeing or valuing the path you chose instead. I dismissed your career in marketing as less significant, less substantial than what Michael and I were doing." He shook his head slightly, regret evident in his expression. "This past week has shown me how short-sighted that was. Your creative vision, your strategic thinking, your ability to see possibilities where others see only problems. Those skills saved our family from financial disaster. Skills you developed precisely because you followed your own path, not mine." The words washed over me like a healing balm, addressing wounds so old and deep I had almost forgotten they were still raw. "Thank you for saying that," I said softly. "It means a lot to hear you acknowledge it." "It should have been acknowledged long ago," he said with surprising humility. "Your grandfather saw it in you, even when you were young. He used to tell me, 'Alexandra has the vision to see what could be, not just what is.' I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now." The mention of my grandfather brought a fresh wave of emotion. He always made me feel like my perspective mattered, even when it was different from everyone else's. A wisdom I failed to learn from him, my father admitted. Until now, perhaps. We sat in silence for a moment, the years of misunderstanding and mutual disappointment slowly giving way to something new. Not perfect understanding, but at least recognition, respect, the beginning of a healthier relationship. "The offer I mentioned before," my father said eventually, "about a position at the company focused on sustainable marketing, environmental branding, it still stands. But with no pressure, no expectations, only if it's something that would interest you, on your terms." I considered this carefully. A week ago, I would have rejected the idea outright, too wary of being pulled back into old family patterns. But now, with these new dynamics, these shifted perspectives, "I'm not saying no," I told him. "But I'm not saying yes yet either. I'd need to think about it, to be sure it was right for both of us." He nodded, accepting this midpoint between rejection and acceptance. Fair enough. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I'm proud of you, Alexandra. Not just for what you've done this week, but for who you've become by following your own path. The words I had longed to hear for so many years, offered freely at last. Thank you, Dad, I said simply, knowing he would understand the depth of feeling behind those 3 words. The following days passed in a whirlwind of activity. The letter of intent from GreenTech successfully placated our lender, buying us the time needed to finalize both transactions. Legal teams worked around the clock drafting agreements, conducting due diligence, preparing for the closings. My mother threw herself into planning the restoration of the lake house cabin, reconnecting with local craftspeople who had worked with my grandfather years ago. Michael dove into restructuring the financial models for Lakeside Pines, incorporating the conservation focus and GreenTech's technological contributions. I found myself bridging both worlds, helping my mother with the lake house planning while also developing marketing strategies for the reimagined Lakeside Pines. The work was engaging, meaningful, drawing on my professional skills while serving my family's needs. 10 days after our meeting at GreenTech, we gathered for the official closings, first Lakeside Pines in the morning, then the lake house restructuring in the afternoon. Signatures were exchanged, documents notarized, funds transferred. By late afternoon, it was official. Lakeside Pines had been saved and would be transformed into a cutting-edge conservation development, while the lake house cabin and majority of the property had returned to Mitchell family ownership. As we left the attorney's office, my mother surprised us all by announcing she'd arranged for us to visit the lake house immediately. "The keys are ours again," she said with quiet satisfaction. I thought we should go see it together as a family. The hour-long drive north passed with a lightness I hadn't felt in years, all of us sharing stories and memories of summers at the lake. Even my father contributed, recalling fishing trips with his father, moments I had never heard him speak of before. When we pulled up to the familiar gravel driveway, a surge of emotion caught me off guard. The cabin stood just as I remembered it. Cedar shingles weathered to a soft gray, wide porch wrapping around 2 sides, the massive stone chimney rising along one wall. Through the trees, I could glimpse the shimmer of the lake, though the shoreline itself now belonged to the Thorntons. "Home," I whispered, not realizing I'd spoken aloud until my mother squeezed my shoulder in silent agreement. We walked through the cabin together, our footsteps echoing on the wooden floors. It needed work. Dust had settled over everything, and there was a musty scent of disuse. But the bones were exactly as they had always been. The stone fireplace where my grandfather had told his stories, the kitchen with its worn butcher block, counters, the bedrooms with their simple pine furniture and handmade quilts. Through the windows, I could see my grandfather's gardens, somewhat overgrown but still recognizable. The Japanese maples he'd so carefully tended, the perennial beds arranged in drifts of compatible colors, the stone path winding through it, all. "We should plant something new," my mother suggested, following my gaze. "Something to mark this chapter, this return." "I'd like that," I agreed. My father stood in the doorway, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "Your grandfather would be pleased," he said finally. "Not just that the cabin is back in the family, but that it took all of us working together to make it happen." Michael joined us, a bottle of champagne and 4 glasses in hand. "I found these in the kitchen," he explained. "Mom must have snuck them in earlier." She smiled, not denying the accusation. Some occasions deserve a proper toast. We gathered on the porch as Michael poured the champagne, the late afternoon sun filtering through the trees in dappled patterns across the weathered boards. Below us, just visible through the trees, I could see where the property line now ran, closer to the cabin than before, but with the most meaningful parts preserved. "To family," my mother proposed, raising her glass. To healing old wounds and finding new paths forward. To Grandpa's legacy, Michael added. Both the tangible one of this place and the less visible one of his values, his vision. To partnerships, my father contributed. Business and personal, past and future. When my turn came, I looked at each of their faces. My mother's gentle determination, my father's newfound humility, my brother's rediscovered authenticity. To crisis as opportunity, I said. To discovering that what seemed like an ending was really a beginning. We clinked glasses, the crystal ringing clear in the quiet afternoon. As I sipped the champagne, I gazed out at the garden where my grandfather's ashes had been scattered, feeling his presence more strongly than I had in years. Not as a ghost or spirit, but as an influence, a set of values and perspectives that had shaped all of us, even when we hadn't recognized it. My parents had sold our vacation home without telling me, an act that had felt like the ultimate betrayal. Yet that single decision had triggered a cascade of events that ultimately transformed our family, financially, professionally, and most importantly, emotionally. The lake house had come back to us, but what we had regained was far more than just a property. We had recovered relationships long damaged by misunderstanding and rigid expectations. We had discovered new ways of seeing each other, valuing each other's unique contributions. We had become, perhaps for the first time, a functional family unit rather than a collection of individuals moving in parallel but separate paths. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across the porch, I found myself filled with an unexpected sense of gratitude, not just for the resolution of the immediate crisis, but for the crisis itself. Without that profound disruption, would we ever have found our way to this new understanding? Would my father have recognized the value in my different path? Would I have seen the strength in my brother's steadfastness? Would my mother have discovered her own power as a connector, a relationship builder? Sometimes I realized we need to lose something precious before we can truly understand its value. Sometimes it takes a devastating revelation to clear away the accumulated debris of years of misunderstanding, creating space for new growth, new connections, new possibilities. The lake house would always be special to me, a physical link to my grandfather and the values he had instilled. But now it represented something more, a symbol of resilience, of family bonds tested but ultimately strengthened, of the capacity for people to change, to grow, to see beyond their own limited perspectives. As darkness fell and we turned on, the old cabin lights, their warm glow spilling onto the porch and into the garden beyond, I felt a sense of completion, of coming full circle. The journey that had begun with shock and betrayal had led us through pain, determination, strategic planning, and finally to this moment of peaceful reconnection. My parents had sold our vacation home without telling me, and I had been devastated. But rather than seeking simple revenge, I had channeled that pain into finding a resolution that served all of us, protecting my parents' financial future while reclaiming my grandfather's legacy. In doing so, I had discovered strengths I hadn't known I possessed and helped my family find a new way of relating to each other. The retirement funds my parents had risked on Lakeside Pines were now secure, transformed into a pioneering conservation development that would showcase sustainable practices for generations to come. The lake house, though smaller in acreage, had returned to family ownership, its most meaningful features preserved for future Mitchells to enjoy. But the most significant transformation wasn't visible in property deeds or financial statements. It was evident in the way my father now listened when I spoke, in how my mother had found her voice in family decisions, in the easy camaraderie that had replaced the wary distance between my brother and me. As we settled into the familiar rooms of the cabin that night, preparing to stay over just as we had during countless summer visits in years past, I felt a profound sense of peace. Whatever challenges might lie ahead, and life would certainly bring more, we would face them differently, now. Not as isolated individuals pursuing separate agendas, but as a family, each contributing our unique strengths toward common goals. The crisis had become an opportunity. The betrayal had led to healing. The ending had become a beginning. And in that transformation lay the most valuable legacy of all. Not the properties or investments we might pass to future generations, but the example of how a family could lose its way, and then, through honesty, effort, and willingness to change, find a new and better path forward together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.